Thanks, Aisha. Thanks, Johan, and thanks, Marith. So just a very quick kind of introduction. My foray into behavioral sciences has been through brimstone and fire. I am formally trained as a marine biologist and studied up to a master's level. But the more and more I got busy into the academic world and then into the conservation world, the more and more I realized that we weren't making the big shifts. We weren't making the big systemic movements or the big strides. And while there was lots of good work, and there currently still is lots of good work going on, something wasn't bending, something wasn't changing. And I quickly realized is that in order for us to have any type of environmental or sustainability or conservation change, somebody's behavior had to change. And when that behavior changed, the impact of that then resulted in the types of changes we wanted to see. So then I kind of launched into behavioral change, particularly environmental behavioral change, behavioral sciences, and a little bit of very light touch on conservation psychology. And I think today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how behavioral science can actually speed up and influence our sustainability and conservation journeys across all realms. I'm going to be focusing on some theory that underpins behavioral science and in the environmental space, and exactly what it is, what is pro-environmental behavior, what is the expectation, what are the barriers we face in order to do this. And then by way of example, one of the projects that I've been very fortunate since starting to work in WWF in 2015 and a long journey with WWF as well, is working on a program that has been steeped within behavioral sciences, and its foundation is around behavioral change. So I'm not too sure if people have noted, but the word behavioral science or behavior change is becoming quite a buzzword. For the first time, we saw it in the final IPCC report. The UN has now been punting behavioral science and the importance of it. And now they've actually developed a behavioral science network. And I'd encourage people that are interested in this topic at the end of my talk to go to that link and actually join. It's a free community. You can join, you get latest podcasts, you get really good kind of rigorous scientific publications and reports. And you start to understand that how we can use behavioral science to infiltrate traditional conservation efforts, traditional sustainability efforts, and actually speed processes up. At WWF South Africa and within the broader WWF network, we've seen behavioral science come to the forefront. And the little quote is that you see on the side is from our ex-lead of our markets project, Christina Close, and she was one of the big drivers along with a South African scientist called Tatiana van Borman, who kind of spearheaded this idea of trying to put behavioral science quite strongly within how we look at conservation, and then to try and find ways to embed it. And that's where I came in and actually started bringing the theory, the understanding, and the frameworks within the projects that we were doing. I love this quote because it makes sense. And RARE is a behavioral science organization, and they work across many disciplines. Their strongest disciplines actually in the medical fields, but now they've kind of stretched their wings across a lot of the environmental fields. And what he's saying is that conservation sustainability is a behavioral challenge. And in order for us to address that, we need behaviorally informed solutions. And that's pretty much where we start. But in order to understand what that quote means, we first of all need to understand what does environmental behavior change mean. Now, environmental behavior change, and very often I get it, it's better communications. Oh, it's just giving people the awareness that they need. And it's actually none of those. What it actually is a very strong systemic evidence-based process that you kind of put in place when you conceive a environmental project, all the way down to ideation, all the way down to developing the product, all the way down to implementing. And your goal, whatever that environmental goal is to be able to shift and reduce the impacts on the negative impacts on the environment, and to promote, whether that promotion is conservation, preservation, or sustainability or improvement. It is vitally important to know that behavioral sciences is a science. It's something that's looked at quite quantitatively and qualitatively, and it involves sciences, economics, and conservation. It requires us to work with all relevant stakeholders, and it requires us to understand the behavior, even before you jump into the project of those stakeholders. It is couched within sound environmental knowledge. You have to have the environmental knowledge as well to be able to see where you embed the behavioral science into. And in that way, you jointly, currently, kind of develop your behavioral science strategy along with your environmental strategy. So the two pathways work together, and that will help you transform a specific sector. What's important is, if you look at the little drawing on your right there, you can't tag behavioral science either at the beginning or the end. It has to be something that you fully integrate. If you don't do that, you run the risk of A, not convincing the stakeholders within your project, B, getting very meaningless results at the end, and C, feeling like all you've done is had a little tag on of things. Behavioral sciences in the environmental arena is also very much people-centered, and it requires a human-centered approach as well. It must understand what are the drivers of somebody's behavior within that conservation space, sustainability space, overconsumption space. What are their motivators? What is pushing this behavior that you're trying to unlock? And what are their constraints? And when I talk about constraints, it can even be something as simple as infrastructure or the lack thereof. And once you understand the drivers, motivators, and constraints, that starts underpinning somebody's decision-making. You can then look at how your behavioral framework can help shift those drivers, motivators, and constraints. It must be framed in context. And this, for a South African audience or an African audience, is very important. A behavioral project that is developed in the global north or in an EU country or in the US, you cannot copy paste in South Africa at all. You have to fully understand the context in which you're operating. And when we develop behaviorally informed conservation projects, it looks very different to a project anywhere else in the world, and it acts very differently. It takes a lot more funding, and sometimes it takes less funding, and it takes sometimes a little bit more time, and other times the turnover is quite quick. As I said, it must be couched in sound environmental knowledge as well. So you can't leave that hanging somewhere. You have to understand all these different parts to make your puzzle fit. It has to be deliberate. You can't say, well, I've put a really good conservation project together. And yeah, we are talking to people and communities and fishers and farmers. So we're probably doing some behavior work. Well, not quite. It has to be very deliberate and fully fixed into your concept, design, and implementation. And lastly, and a very important thing, behavioral science is a science. Communications is a different discipline. They're not one and the same. And very often I get told that I've run a communications campaign and I'm going to shift behavior. Well, not quite. These are two very separate things. And then when you throw marketing in, it confuses the whole pot. So we need to understand that behavioral science, marketing, and conservation are three very different elements, and they have to be treated. Yes, communications is vitally important in terms of the pipeline intervention, but it isn't the beginning and the end. It is part of a process. So if we quickly look at what is pro-environmental behavior. So when we develop a behavioral science project, what we want to do is shift somebody's behavior to be pro-environmental. And this involves an individual or group of individuals or a collective actually adopting a behavior that will promote environmental sustainability, that will reduce resource consumption, that might minimize an action that is actually destructive to a habitat, and that might actually mitigate some of the impacts and the effects of climate change. It is an enabling mechanism to help somebody make conscious choices where the environment is part of the qualifiers within their decision-making. And very often, we strongly kind of push the idea that behavioral science has to create and bring to the fore and the understanding that we are interconnected with nature and the environment. So instead of saying to somebody, go green, which actually nobody can understand, because what does that mean? You would have to then couch your messaging quite strongly in something like, please do not use a single-use plastic item like this one. Use this alternative. Or very often, if you're talking to some audiences, things like, you need to provide a value to our ocean is what would drive a behavior, rather than saying you need to protect the seas. Because as soon as something and somebody intrinsically values something, they have better chance of shifting their behavior. Now, individual pro-environmental strategies are crucial. You can shift an individual, but you got to look at a collective intervention as well, because we're at a stage now where we have to shift systems quickly. And when I talk about a collective, I can talk about governments, policies, corporates, or community actions. And very often, what we're trying to do within the work I'm doing, looking at markets transformation, is working at that corporate initiatives. How do we get big corporates or sectors or markets or key commodity supply chains to shift their behavior? And at the same time, with some of the seafood work I do, I also look at how do we shift consumer behavior? How do we shift individuals' behavior? So the application of behavioral science is vast. We just got to get it right, and we got to make it fit properly within an environmental program. The idea is that it reflects a commitment to responsible stewardship of natural resources, and it's a recognition of the importance of conserving, sustainably utilizing biodiversity for human as well as nature's well-being. And that is the kind of thinking you want to get into people's heads. And you'll see when I go to the next slide, why this makes my job both very exciting and extremely challenging, because of the way we actually think as a species. So very often, we have two conventions of thinking, and we filter information and messages through these two processes. The one is called peripheral processing. And here we tend to, it's very driven by emotions, sensations, intuition, heuristics, which means rules of thumb. I've done it this way, I've always done it this way, I'm always going to go this way. And it's quick and it's pragmatic. But it then instills very weak attitudes and intentions. And while most of us know I can have super good intentions, but I never follow through with an action, a lot of people don't understand, or they don't get the little trigger, that behavior equals action. Okay? It's what I do, not what I think or what I say. It's what my action at the end of all of that becomes. What's amazing is that we use peripheral processing 80% of our decisions. And it's evolutionary because the other option, which is central processing, is where you weigh the pros and cons, you look at the arguments, you think about it logically. It's slow, it's costly, but it instills very strong attitudes and intentions. Now, where we can use central processing is when you're filling in your bond forms, when you're looking at your life insurance, you look at the fine print. You try to understand the pros and cons. You make the right list to make the right choices. You understand what are the big beliefs and values that underpin that. We use that central processing very limited. We use peripheral processing, or what we call non-conscious decision-making, 80% of our decisions. And the reason for that is, as I said, it's evolutionary. If you were standing in a savanna and you saw a lion, there's no way you're going to go, well, that tree is like 5 degrees to my left and it's 4 meters high. And if that central processing, by then the lion would have run at you and eaten you. Your decision is, there's the tree, I need to get away from the lion, and you use peripheral thinking. And if you don't get eaten by the lion, it's something you reinforce. As we've progressed, we've continually used peripheral processing. So all of our decisions are now peripheral, even ones that start off not being peripheral. So for example, if you make a really tough decision on which peanut butter you're going to buy, right? I'm going to buy this one for this reason, for whatever these reasons are. But then you go to the store and they've shifted the shelf on which your peanut butter is sitting. You notice how frustrated people get, because they know, I go to that store, that's where my peanut butter is, that is the brand I buy, and they take it and they leave. Now you shift that, and immediately centralized processing has to come into play to find it, and where have they put it, and is the brand still available? And people don't like this. So we rely very heavily on basically peripheral processing. The thing is, most of our habits follow, most of our actions follow. So for me as a behavioral scientist and a practitioner, try and get you to change how you look at the environment, how you treat the environment, what choices you make that basically promote sustainability. I have to almost break through your peripheral processing and get you to start using central processing and let that become the conservation, the sustainable choosing, the informed choice move from being a central processing thinking to your peripheral processing thinking. And this is bits of the behavioral sciences and the conservation psychology. So I'm not going to give you any more of that because it is a lot. When we look at behavioral frameworks and you dig into, I love to say that behavioral frameworks, entering into the world of behavioral frameworks is like going into the cupboard of Narnia. There are so many, and they are, in any form or shape. There are ones that are for health and health and medical reasons. There are ones for environment. There are ones for getting people to drive slower, drive faster. And then there's more generic ones that you can apply. And WWF International, and as a network, we've developed our own. It's the SPN. It stands for Save Nature Please. And in that, that's driven towards a framework to help with environmental projects. But there's many. There's EAST, developed by the Behavioral Intervention in the UK, and that's basically make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, make it fun. And one of the most common ones is by an academic called Susan Michi from the US, and it's called the COMBI. The COMBI framework is, what are the capabilities you're facing? What are the motivations? And what are the opportunities that will shift somebody's behavior and create a new kind of status quo? The frameworks are everywhere. And if you kind of get into the academics of it, there's just a cautionary warning that you can get yourself into a lot of kind of stuck in theoretical framework without kind of moving towards the implementation part of this. So I would just warn you, choose one, find one that fits what you're trying to do. If it doesn't fit, then go back to your box of tricks. Try not to work with too many. The next thing I want to go on is some of the fun parts of the behavioral project. The theory, you've got that, you understand that. The fun part is trying to break through the conventional thinking, as we like to call it. And for years, we have been stuck in this conventional thinking. For example, awareness drives action. No, it doesn't. Awareness and attitude does not equal action. I am aware of lots of things. I should go to the gym every day. Shouldn't eat that second piece of chocolate cake. I should drink more water. But whether I follow through with that on my action is a different story. And we actually call this the awareness action gap. And that results in the behavior gap. In other words, I have all of this in my head. I know what I should do. I know my intentions are solid and valid, but I don't act on it. Parts of that kind of come in with me not acting on the intervention is how I feel, because as a human being as well. So very often in the environmental space, what we see is we see people say, well, the problem, for example, climate change, is so big and overwhelming that I have a low self-efficacy, which means I don't believe my efforts are going to make a difference. Now, a lot of the work we've done here has been with the South African audience, and South Africans definitely have low self-efficacy. It's something we see very often, whether we're working in the land space or the ocean space, whether we work in the farming space, whether we work in food waste space, whether I'm working on consumption, it is that low efficacy, that idea that my energies and efforts just will come up to naught when it comes to the environment. The other one, which is we found in a lot of our seafood work, is what we call rationalizing or over-rationalizing. Well, you know what? It's dead already. I might as well eat this kilogram of prawns. Or if I don't eat it, somebody else is going to eat it. Or if I don't sell it, somebody else is going to sell it. And based on that over-rationalization, they don't change their behavior. We also, there's the conventional thinking or the myth busting, is that human beings, and we all make decisions that are fully conscious, deliberate, and even rational. And we know that that's not true. Both the psychological science and the behavioral science tell us that we rely a lot on rules of thumb. We make quick, very irrational, very uninformed, very how I feel kind of questions. Okay, and we make decisions based on that. And what we find with that is that, as I said earlier, it's very difficult to get somebody out of that. And we don't make deliberate decisions. So to get somebody to make a deliberate decision when it comes to the environment or conservation or sustainability becomes quite a challenge in itself. Specifically for a South African audience, we find that if you show South African audiences things around doom, gloom, and fear and guilt, South African audiences pull away. Don't show them tons and tons of thousands of fish caught in nets that are dying. It will not elicit a pro-environmental action, not at all. It'll make people angry, most people. It will make people upset. But in terms of changing, when you come back down to whether they should have been eating those prawns or not, it doesn't elicit that behavior change. Now, this is very country and context specific. South Africans don't follow a fear-based kind of guilt tripping. But if you had to apply that kind of conservation project with a behavioral underpinning of fear and gloom and doom in an American context, people react. So that's why I said the context in which you operate becomes very, very important. And then the last one, which I see often, is in order to shift somebody's behavior to a more pro-environmental behavior, is incentivization. Incentivization can work for a limited time and a limited number of people. Okay. And very often you'll find that incentivization can backfire. I know I'll get money, I'm just going to get money and not change my behavior. They are short-term solutions and they don't build loyalty. As soon as something changes, they'll switch again. And if you have a limited project with very little resources, unfortunately, you'll get to a point where your resources are drained and the behavior shifts back to where it used to be. So these are some of the conventional thinking, and I want to propose some alternative levers of behavior change that we need to work. And I'm not throwing these out at all. I'm just saying these we use together with some more unconventional behavioral thinking, or what we like to call alternative levers of behavior. So, right. So these are some of those behavioral changes. We're looking at understanding what we call choice architecture. Now, choice architecture could either be the physical architecture, or it could be the architecture of how one makes choices in one's brain. And it's the understanding is, how do you make somebody's choice of environment, make somebody choose the environment without changing the value of the consumer's options? Okay, so very often you'll hear people saying, well, sustainability is really expensive. It's actually not very true. So they have some value in sustainability, but the fact that price is the biggest qualifier, they're choosing price over sustainability. So there's ways you need to find shift the architecture and change that. All right, for example, in the seafood space, when I hear that, I actually kind of get quite irate, because sustainable seafood is actually cheaper because it's things like hake and snook, whereas unsustainable seafood is things like rock lobster, it's prawns, it's some of your expensive reef fish. So it's actually more expensive to eat unsustainable seafood than it is to eat sustainable seafood. So there's all of those behavior and those kind of thinkings that we have that we need to shift as well. The other way we use, and this is a great lever, is social influences or social leverages. And here we can use social networks, and I'm not talking about social media in the least, but I'm actually talking about communities and people that influence communities and how they think. We are social creatures, and we are bound, and very often, and even though you can tell me I'm an independent thinker, I don't follow social norms, I don't need things socialized, I don't adhere to peer pressure, at some level you do. And if you can find somebody that's putting the good things in before the jelly sets, that's the kind of social influences you want to use. We have found a lot of use in social influences, leveraging consumer networks. It can be anybody. It doesn't have to be some celebrity. It doesn't have to be a marketer. It can be your priest, your kid. We find in the seafood space, children are amazing social levers because they have something called the pester power. If you get the right things into a kid and they pester their kid, their parent enough, parents will change their behavior. Wonderful game changers. Human beings have this desire for reciprocity. They have this desire for prestige. One of the biggest social influences is observability. If you observe your neighbor recycling, you will recycle. And there's been an experiment done, and the paper is available, where during the Christmas rush in the US, they were trying to get people to stop parking in the handicapped spaces. And it just wasn't working. So what they did was they looked at observability as a behavioral intervention. And they painted really realistic eyes on the walls in front of a handicap parking. As soon as somebody came in, it looked like they were being observed. They decreased handicap parking by 90%. You don't like to be observed doing the wrong thing. And if you constantly stop doing the wrong thing, you start doing the right thing. You shift your behavior. So those are just some of the examples, but there's a litany of examples as well. The other ones is emotional appeals. And behavioral sciences uses emotional appeals because they do. When something touches your heart, when something shifts how you feel, you can use that to drive behavior. We saw a lot of this, and we saw this massive anti-straw movement when we all saw that video of the person pulling the straw out of the turtle's nose, and the screaming turtle and the blood and the absolute anguish this animal was feeling. And immediately it started such a strong and rigorous and basically an exhaustive campaign against straws. And up till today, we're still seeing the impacts of people moving to paper straws, people completely removing straws out, and then moving to some other products which are not so good, like biodegradable straws in South Africa, which we actually can't biodegrade, etc. But there was a shift from using plastic straws. And it was done by that emotional cue. The other one that from our research that we've done when we've surveyed South Africans, the positive emotions South Africans feel is pride, togetherness, compassion, and passion. Perfect example, Rugby World Cup. What was the key messaging? Stronger together. South Africans thrive in the idea of Ubuntu. They thrive in the whole idea of togetherness and shifting systems in a positive framework. Those are some of the emotional appeals that environmental programs have to embed. We have to use to shift how and what is happening to our planet at the moment and how we want to bring about big systemic changes. And we can do that. And if we do that with kids and their parents, it's a winning, and we're ready off to a really good start. And we can actually entrench that kinds of behavior. But you cannot take a shotgun approach. So you can't just say, I'm going to use this behavioral framework in this conservation project for all South Africans. That doesn't work. One of the key elements of behavioral change is what we call audience segmentation. We need to figure out who in this group of people can we influence and who's going to help us pull over everybody else. Now, most of you would have heard of Everett's diffusion model, where he has the game changers or the innovators, then he has the early adopters, then you have the rest of the world, and then you have the laggards. It's a very similar theory. You find that audience that you know will shift quickly, but they'll also influence and use them. And that's pretty much what you target at. You cannot target at the whole country or whole population or whole group. You have to find the right people, provide the right context to drive your conservation project. So now I'm going to take you through an example that we're using at WWF. And behavior change is challenging. And the other thing that it does, it's not quick. And this is something I constantly am frustrated with funders, because they give you a 2-year funding grant or a 3-year funding grant and say, well, go and shift South Africans' behavior around rhino poaching, around consumption, around food waste. And you're like, well, no, it doesn't work like that. Behavior change can take 5 to 10 years. And if it's iterative, and it requires you to constantly monitor and evaluate and find meaningful changes, because you want to be able to show the cause and correlation of the intervention is what's causing the behavior to shift. And that takes time. But when you get it right, it works wonderfully well, and you entrench those sound pro-environmental behaviors. So let's go on to the example. This is the ocean that I love, the ocean that I studied, the ocean that I know provides all the air we breathe. Well, most of the air we breathe, not quite all the air we breathe. So 70% of the air we breathe. The food from about 17% of the world gets their protein. It basically carbon sequestrates so much carbon out of the atmosphere because of carbon sinks, because of chlorophyll. It is a shared resource. It basically probably everything that you're wearing traveled on the oceans. It provides so much spiritual and cultural significance to so many South Africans. It provides a livelihood, it provides jobs. Unfortunately, when I talk to most South Africans, they see this. And I've got to get them to understand that in order for them to have this going into the future, we need to protect and conserve and look after that and ensure that that is improved, restored, so that you can have that going into the future. But what we're finding is some of these horrific stats. And yes, I know I told you South Africans don't do well with horrific stats, but sometimes you got to tell them some stats to get the engines running. And these stats are, that 94% of our world's fish stocks, this is globally, it's not South Africa, is pretty much fully fished or considered unsustainable. We are consuming now, on average, globally, about 20.2 kilograms of seafood. We're hitting 7.8 billion. When we hit our 10 billion, how much more seafood are we going to eat? In a South African context, it's quite scary, because we're seeing more and more South Africans transitioning to a seafood diet. Now, when you have this kind of reliance on the sea, but you have this kind of situation where we have horrific overfishing, we have extreme irresponsible farming, we have climate change throwing its hand onto the oceans. And remember, it's a big body of water. So even though while we on land, on terra firma, might not see the impact of climate change, the climate is having a severe impact on our oceans. And yeah, I'm not just talking about melting ice caps, but it's changing pH, it's shifting distributions. We've seen the sardine stocks move from the west coast to the south coast. That has huge implications for the fishes, the boats, the factories. We've seen people catching sardine now off Mossel Bay and then having to truck it to Saldanha Bay where it is canned. Huge implications in terms of what climate change can do beyond just the ocean. And then we see this massive growing population that is so more determined to eat seafood because they believe it's healthier and they believe it's less GM'd. They believe it's better for the climate than eating beef, etc., etc. On top of all of this, we have really bad fishing methods. So we have unbelievably high bycatch rates. And when I say bycatch, it's fish that we don't do anything with it. It's stuff we throw back and it's either dead or dying. We're killing either parts of the ecosystem, so your big top predators like turtles, sharks, and rays and seabirds, but we're also removing large amounts of fish. So we're shifting the marine ecosystem to a point where we're taking out so much, not allowing it to restore, that we're actually going to cause it to collapse. This is just our impact. Our other impact, which is just beyond fishing, is habitat destruction through mining, through effluent, as you all very much know about the sewage issues we've had around the country. Our impacts of leaving gear for ghost fishing, and ghost fishing is very evident. And I can tell you now, no report I've read has given us an accurate number in terms of people that are lost, animals that are lost, or nets that are pulled up that are left in the ocean still fishing. And then the big one that everybody's talking about in the recent years is plastics in our oceans. 8 million metric tons per annum and growing dumped into the ocean. That's what, 1 dump truck per minute. So big problem. So one of the ways to try and help move this was to shift behavior through what is known as the Southern African Sustainable Seafood Initiative. And SASSI is an old program. It's already 20, and it's been with WWF for, I think, 19 of those 20 years. And it's one of those programs that is steeped within a behavioral model. And I'm going to talk to you about the behavioral model. So SASSI's theory of change is that if we are able to mobilize, build awareness, begin and motivate intrinsically individuals through the SASSI list by giving them tools and pathways, we can then empower them and empower the retailers through a non-regulatory method of shifting the practices of the fishing industry, to move and shift them to be more responsible. In order to achieve this beautiful theory of change, we then used a very strong community-based social marketing. It is not social media. It's just the way the phrase is. Community-based social marketing behavior change framework. It's a framework that's developed by a man called Douglas Mackenzie Moore. He's based in Canada, and he actually has an institute that's dedicated to shifting behavior and using community-based social marketing frameworks. And it has some assumptions in that information alone does not change behavior. We need to identify why is somebody's behavior not changing, and how do we change it, and what are the benefits of not changing it, and how do we then counter that. We need to use evidence-based behavior change tools, the ones I showed earlier, like EAST and EPIC. We need to pilot it, and then we need to evaluate our results. We also need to understand that we need to get some kind of commitment. We need to normalize the good behavior, or normalize a good situation, like make sustainable seafood the default in all the stores in which you shop. In that way, we almost then make it shifted from that very processed thinking to the peripheral thinking, where when you go in the store and you take your favorite fish off the shelf, it's already sustainable. So we're trying at this point to use this behavior model to create those interventions. So the objective of SASSY is threefold. One, it has to start with creating that awareness, so we can't get away from that. But two, it's also to discourage consumers from choosing illegal, unsustainable seafood. And then three, three is very important. If I tell a person not to do something, you have to give them the tools on what they can do and how they can do it. So three is about equipping them with those pathways. It becomes very, very important to shift behavior, to give somebody a way to shift their behavior. I just want to talk about the SASSY audience. As I spoke to earlier, audience segmentation is very important. So when I came into the program in 2015, the audience that SASSY was looking at was a white audience. They were between 40 to 50-year-old men and women. They were from middle to upper income brackets. They consumed seafood more than twice a week. And they were sitting in quite a high level LSM, but now it's called SEM. And it was believed that this group would shift the market. We then redid all the stats, because I kind of didn't feel that that was how South Africa had changed after 94. And there were big shifts, because if you walked into an ocean basket, you weren't really seeing just that demographic. And we realized that actually by 2015 onwards, that all race groups were consuming seafood. The age had shifted from 15 to 55, men and women. There was still that middle to upper income bracket, but because we were seeing this big growth in that kind of middle income group in Black and Indian South Africans, they were consuming a lot more seafood as well. They were a lot more tech savvy, and there was this diversity of culture. Food, and especially seafood, became aspirational. People want to eat it because they didn't or they couldn't before, so they were aspiring to eat it. And one of the clear indicators was how seafood itself started being monitored. Now, for those of us that are a bit more senior, we'll remember Lucky Star sardines. This is not how Lucky Star sardines was advertised when I was growing up. It was a tin, and you ate it with brown bread. It was a non-vat, zero-vatted, wonderful oily fish, high in protein. I wasn't eating it for super sexiness or super gym body, but this is how it has shifted. Those of us that are a little bit more senior will know that 10 or 15 years ago, if you found a sushi bar in a Pick and Pay or a Spa, you were lucky. Nowadays, you can go to any big retailer. I've been to Nelspruit, and Nelspruit sells sushi, fresh sushi made every day. So we've seen this massive transition in diets. So it meant that SASSY had to change the audience it was looking at. SASSY is quite a neat little system, because it works on a very easy traffic light system. It rates the species, and I'll talk a little bit about those species are rated into three colors: red, orange, green. Red, don't buy; orange, think twice; and green is best choice. And the idea is to shift you from, when you're making that choice about what seafood you're going to eat, is to choose the green ones. I don't say don't choose the orange ones. I just say don't choose them all the time, because they are of some concern. The science, as I mentioned earlier, has to underpin what I'm telling somebody to do. And SASSI goes through quite a rigorous scientific process to rate a species. The listing process is called the Common Assessment Methodology. It's developed by the WWF network. It's used across the network because we need it for comparability. For those of you who don't know, the reason why is that in South Africa, we export 50% of our fish and we import 50% of our fish because our fish is really good quality. So it gets a higher price in EU and US and Asian markets. But then we still got to feed South Africans while loving seafood. So we import really junky stuff from other parts of the world. And I promise you, I don't say junky without having been taste tested. Calamari from Patagonia versus calamari from Cape St. Francis, our stuff by far more is a lot more delicious. In Spain and in Portugal, South African calamari is actually referred to as white gold. As a result, we need a system that rates them that we can use across countries. We've kind of assessed about 200 species. And the reason we have to do so many assessments is because a species can be caught by multiple fisheries, and not all fishing practices are equal. Trawl has a much bigger impact than a hand line or a long line. A long line has a much bigger impact than a hand line. A purse seine has a lower impact, a much bigger impact than a pole and line caught tuna. So you have to assess the species, its fishing method, as well as the impact of that fishing method on the environment. And that is how we come up with our SASSI colors. Once we've got the colors, we take all of that very heavy scientific information, and we got to motivate, socialize, and ease the consumer into making those right choices. So at WWF SASSI, we use the motivate, socialize, and ease model. It's very quick, it's very easy, and it actually has been working over years. The first thing is we affirm identity and frame messages to the values of that segment of audiences we are working with. South Africans are geared towards how affordable is it? How tasty is it? What is the quality? What is the accessibility? What is the health status? And then right at the bottom, what is sustainability? And what my job and my team's job is to shift that sustainability to be one of the top qualifiers so that that becomes something you already filter when you're making a sustainable choice. Once again, we leverage those positive emotions in a lot of the work we do to try and get people to shift how they work. The reason the little curly bracket is on those qualifiers is those are also what we often call as psychographic. Psychographic is your propensity to change your behavior. Okay, so basically your beliefs, your values, your attitudes, etc. And we got to fully understand that of our audience as well in order to make sure that how we present the process and the messaging and the tools, that there will be uptake. Now, I remember I told you this is based at a collective of individuals, and behavior change works well when you have multiple interventions at different levels. So within the seafood supply chain, which is this little graph, this little iconic here on this side, while we work with consumers, yes, we do, and that's the SASSI consumer program. We also have a SASSI program that works with retailers and suppliers. So we got these dual projects that run together to try and transform the seafood market and the seafood supply chain. And that idea is to help shift the practices that the industry has on the water. We have what we call our retailer supplier participation scheme project, which is with all those big retailers, 2 big seafood franchises, which is Ocean Basket and John Dory, and then 1 big seafood supplier known as Brico. And these companies have already made formalized commitments to shift and transform the seafood supply chain. So eventually, the role of the consumer will be to hold these retailers and suppliers accountable. So if you went to a Pick and Pay or a ShopRite, any seafood product you take should be sustainable, but you can then double check them and hold them accountable. And that's like the best part, because you would have known that that species is not sustainable. So why is ShopRite, or why is Pick and Pay, or why is Spar selling it? So these 2 programs, the 2 sister programs, sit together and they work to help shift both the supply chain on the retailer side as well as the consumer side. And what's been so interesting, and now that I've kind of worked for so many years, is that when I started, there were such committed individuals in the corporate world to try and shift and try and make these changes to be more sustainable. But it fluctuates. A whole lot of people left and a whole bunch of new people came in. And I got asked the same questions. Why are we doing this? Why are we part of the SASSI program? What does this mean? So that's the whole idea of being iterative and keep having to change the understanding and get people to figure out why it's so important to transform to be more pro-environmental. And once you get that through, then automatically becomes a no-brainer. What is important when you look at the value proposition that you would give a consumer versus a corporate, the value proposition is the most important part here. And one of the best ways in which we're able to garner success here is that sustainability makes good business sense, especially a company wants longevity. And that is something that we find working very well in the seafood space. So every year we need to figure out what our consumers are thinking. So every second year, we run a big consumer survey, a national survey, to understand what are South Africans thinking when it comes to seafood. And I can tell you from the first survey, which was run in 2014, till the last one, which was run in 2022, price, taste, and type of seafood are still the biggest qualifiers. However, for the first time in that list, we're seeing things like, was it responsibly sourced? Was it sustainably sourced? Where is it an endangered species? How was it farmed or caught? These qualifiers we have never seen before. And slowly but surely, we're seeing this growing understanding and awareness where people are choosing these qualifiers. Yes, the percentages are low, but we're getting there. The other form and the second part is to socialize it. And I spoke to you about using the right messages, using the right messengers as well, and using the right levers like peer pressure and observability. So in terms of getting Pick n Pay, ShopRite, and Woolies to all join, observability, peer pressure. Woolies is doing it, Pick n Pay is doing it, I got to do it, ShopRite's got to do it, as well as a shift intrinsically for them to be more sustainability. But I can guarantee you that observability and peer pressure did play quite a strong influence in getting them to sign up to the commitments. The other thing is look at cultural norms. And this is so important in South African context. You'll see it, even geographically, we differ. In the KZN, they call it shad. In the Western Cape, they call it elf. If a SASSI tool does not have both names, I have a million emails in my inbox saying, where is shad? I don't see it on the SASSI tool. The KZN people don't know the sustainability rating of shad. So we have to be very conscious of that. We have to understand cultural norms. We have to understand the people in which we're working with. And then choosing the right messengers. And we work with a lot of chefs. We work with a lot of influencers, but our biggest influencers have been kids. This little guy is called Nsika, lives in Joburg, and he probably knows more about sustainable seafood in the oceans than I do. And he's been one of our biggest champions at schools, at events, at fishing competitions about promoting catch and release and promoting sustainability. I think he's converted his whole family to stop eating fish, but let's see. So using those right elements. And the final one is, how do you get that message across? And this becomes important, using tools that people can understand, that people have easy accessibility that are available, using language. You know, one of the biggest experiments that was recently done was how to change the language of vegetarian and vegan dishes on menus so that people would make that choice sometimes. Because if you say boiled veggies with olive oil or garlic butter, nobody wants it. But if you say a variety of garden veggies sauteed in olive oil, dusted with rosemary, somebody's going to take it because that sounds delicious. Using the right language, visual language. Most people form pictures in their minds. They don't see lots of words. Use visual language. Tell better stories so that the images on here are really amazing. I got asked by a chef one day to come into his freezer because he had bought fish off a bakkie, and when he cooked it, it wasn't behaving like cake. When I got there and we took it to the University of Stellenbosch and we actually had a DNA tested, it actually wasn't cake, it was mako shock. But it looks the same. This story, which I tell a lot of chefs, has now got a lot of chefs to stop, hopefully, buying what they think is hake off the back of a buck, because often it's not hake, it's what they call flake, which is sold in Australia, but there's also illegal catches of our sharks, and it's sold. And the only time you'll know that it's not hake is when you cook it, because it cooks and its texture and how it smells looks very different. And the other one is the myth busting. And I mentioned the myth busting before. Sustainability is more expensive. Language is an important one. And I'll talk to a slide about myth busting when we come to when you see your menus. If we look at the tools very quickly, we've realized we have to provide a variety of tools. We have two really nice apps. We have a fantastic website. We have a pocket card, and we have a poster. We also have all the social medias because of the recent shift towards the digital world. So we have a lot of things around social media. We even have a new app called our Fish ID app, which we're busy working on, that uses neural networks and facial recognition software. Take a picture of a fish and it tells you what it is and its SASSy status. We then also have started looking at gamification, and we started off with a book, which is freely downloadable. We got it matched to the learner outcomes, and we got teachers workshopped to try and play the game to get kids to understand the length of a fish and then its sustainability status. But after COVID, we realized with the digital shift, we now have a SASSy online game. And you can play it. It's on the SASSy website. It's free. And you start the game, and you are the commander of the SASSy submarine, and you have got to catch the sustainable seafood and avoid the unsustainable seafood. And you get a scoring, etc., etc. But in between all of that are these messages around the oceans and around sustainability. So we're even looking at how to shift behavior using gamification. Then we talk about the power of the consumer, and I know this, we're almost done. So the power of the consumer for me has become so important because of the SASSy program. There are two arrows in your quiver that'll basically are your strongest ones, your wallet and your voice. If you don't buy it, no retailer wants to sit with a whole bunch of unsustainable seafood in their fridge. No restaurant wants to do it. And if you use your voice. So consumers, we find, are becoming more and more aware. They're becoming more enabled, and we're hoping that the SASSy tools are doing that. And the behavioral science that underpins it are helping them to shift and make those decisions, but also change their actions. As I said, it's great to have that information in your head. It's great for a chef to know that, but when that chef actually decides to buy the seafood that he's going to serve, he chooses the sustainable product. And this little brown slide is one of the first things we've been working with chefs and restaurants on, is myth busting and mislabeling. Oh my goodness, this is a problem. There is nothing like lionfish. Can be anything. They need to tell you what lionfish it is. Shellfish, same thing. My favorite is haddock. We don't get haddock in South Africa. It's pretty much hake that's colored orange and smoked. Okay. Sea bass isn't a fish. It's a group of fish. So you need to know that it's either red drum, which is orange listed. There's no such thing as salmon trout. There's no species. It's either salmon or it's trout. There's no such thing as salmon trout. And then king and queen prawns just refer to the size, not the sustainability, not what it is. You need to know what it is in order for you as a consumer to check your app, check your pocket card, and decide whether you want it. So your last question is, well, has this actually been effective? You've been running for 20 years. Do you have any stats that show that it's working? And yes, we do. We've been running surveys, as I've said, for many, many years. We've seen an increase, a massive increase in South Africans' awareness around sustainability, around seafood, around overfishing. In terms of the SASSy campaign, we are also seeing a really nice growing trend in that audience of ones that are aware. Now, awareness is great, and I love it, but are they acting on it? And yes, we're seeing an increase in the number that use the tools, and then we're seeing a nice increase in the ones that claim that they use the tools to inform their decisions. Now, these are consumer surveys. When we start the survey, they don't know it's a SASSy survey. We don't show them the logo, the panda, or the three fish, because immediately that will bias their decision making. And we only talk about SASSy at the end of the survey, when they've answered all the other questions around awareness, around making the right choices when they go to a restaurant, about where they eat, etc., etc. The last part I want to talk about is monitoring and evaluation of your behavioral change program. It is so important. You need to build on your successes. You need to learn from your failures. And you have to put in place a monitoring evaluation system and framework when you start the project, not at the end of the project. And you will find that it's iterative. So my favorite line to anybody, especially my colleagues, was say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's put this fantastic conservation strategy together with all these behavioral bits and bobs, and then we're just going to win. And I'm like, nope, never fall in love with your conservation plan or strategy. It is bound to change. Human beings change all the time. People act differently all the time. So you need to understand that every time you might have to reach it. My last slide is around externalities and things that can change behavior in a heartbeat. South Africa, we have lots of these. Day zero. We had this massive shift to people being really, really good about their water consumption. But what did they do? Huge spike in their plastic consumption. People were really good about putting buckets in the showers, but none of that behavior has been retained since the rains come. So these externalities shift behavior very rapidly. Another one is social unrest, like we saw with the flooding, the national climate changes that happened in KZN, the big flooding, the riots, and the chemical explosion, the sewage on the beach. These shift behavior almost negatively, almost immediately. Coronavirus was another big one. People started overpackaging, tremendously started utilizing washing, all of a sudden it went to an extreme of and I understand the human behavior on sanitization, etc., but it shifted a lot of your pro-environmental behavior very quickly. And then, we saw the taxi strikes in Cape Town, that basically we got to a point where people had less access to food during the taxi strike than we actually did during COVID, because they just prevented people and goods from getting to stores, from actually getting to work and actually doing with it. And the ever-growing issue and the bane of most South Africans' existence is load shedding. Load shedding we've seen, and what we're trying to do at WW is develop a project to see the real impact. So nobody's talking about what load shedding is doing for food loss and waste. If a generator goes off in a big retailer overnight and nobody's there to go and check it, things thaw and only gets open at 7 o'clock. What is the impact of the food loss and waste? People are buying more and more preserved, more and more highly processed food because they last longer, they don't denature as quickly. So this is affecting diets. It's affecting what we eat. It's affecting how much of it we eat. So load shedding is also having a massive impact on our actions and our behavior. And what is that having on our planet? I leave everybody with this last kind of thing, and it's, you cannot have a healthy planet if you have unhealthy people or people making poor decisions. But you have to understand why those poor decisions are being made. You have to figure out what are the behavioral opportunities, what are the barriers, and what are the motivators. Then shift it. And when you entrench those good behaviors, automatically you get healthy people and healthy planet. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions people might have. Thanks, Aisha. Thanks, Johan.
Thank you so much, Babs. It was a very phenomenal talk. I think behind the scenes, we're always speaking about how, even in platforms like these, how we are preaching to the choir. So we thank you for that, for not just the theoretical, but the how to influence the practical applications and, like you say, getting people to act on it. So thank you so much. So I already see there are comments as well as questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Sandra Hardy's question, go on to Bridget Pearl's question, and then I'm going to open the floor to any more questions.
Perfect. Go for it.
Okay, so Sandra Hardy is, what is your view on the seismic testing our government is proposing on the southern coastline?
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, so definitely not happy with seismic surveys. We have a position on mining as an organization, and we're really not for seismic surveys in particular as WWF, but as my personal view as well. We don't fully understand the impacts of using seismic surveys on marine, basically fauna and flora. We know the impact on anything with a lateral line and nervous system, because some work's been done in Australia and it's really damaging to these animals. it also has shown that there is an impact on things like zooplankton and phytoplankton, which are the basis of any marine ecosystems. And until we can fully understand what those impacts are, I don't think we should be seismic survey. We have spoken to government. I know that we work with the Center for Environmental Rights, and there's a lot of work being done. I fully agree that this is something we shouldn't enter into.
Absolutely. And it's a massive area. I don't know if the audience is aware that it's actually 12,000 square kilometers of Southern African Ocean, which is just, it's horrendous. Absolutely. But the reaction, the public reaction has been huge.
Yeah.
Huge. So, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Babs. I'm going to move to Bridget Pohl, and I see Sibyl has been quite active in the chat. So I'm not sure if she'd want to unmute, but if she does, then I will get to Sibyl after that.
Sure.
So Bridget Pohl is asking, we're saying, I haven't touched sushi since 2020 because I overthought it and became terrified. It's raw and you don't know who has touched and whether they have washed their hands. What was the quality of the water, where the fish was caught or farmed. And in my opinion, the cheaper, the scarier. Do you have any comments on that, Babs?
Oh, goodness. Oh, absolutely. So sushi is a tricky one because it is one of those aspirational food items that we've seen infiltrate South African diets. Sushi, poke, all of these things. And it speaks to the globalization of the world and the culture shifting, etc., etc. Sushi must be high quality fish. You're absolutely right. The soy is what cauterizes it and makes it healthy to eat. But if it's poor quality fish, you can get very sick from it. Okay. Sushi is also one of those items that I struggle with eating because they can't tell me if it's salmon or trout, because salmon is not always sustainably farmed. There are lots of salmon farms that are irresponsible in their farming methods. Okay. Second of all, it has a massive carbon footprint because it's coming all the way from the other side of the world. I'd rather eat trout, which is farmed in South Africa and Franschhoek and Lesotho. It tastes the same, it looks the same. So Aisha, to your point, we had the Living Planet conference just before COVID, and it was focused on food. And we got the Sun International chef to do a plate of salmon and to do a plate of trout. And we asked people to taste and tell us if they could tell which was which. Nobody got it right. So trout tastes exactly like salmon. It's a very good quality. It's a superb fish. It's local. It has a low footprint. I would suggest you go for that. Crab sticks are not crab. It is hake with crab flavoring. So please know that this is part of the myth busting that we often have to do as well. And then prawns are highly, you have to understand, is it an aquaculture certified prawn? Is it from a farm that's responsible, or is it from a farm that isn't responsible? And there are lots of farms that farm prawns irresponsibly. High E. coli counts, poor water quality, human rights abuses because they use children and women. And that's is part of SASSI's journey, to get consumers to start asking these questions. So you put enough pressure on whoever you're getting your prawns or your sushi from, that they have to start questioning their suppliers, who then have to question their fish farms or the fishing industry.
Okay. Thank you, Babs. I'm not sure, but I think maybe Bridget's menu may have changed for Christmas Day. Okay, so Salo is, thank you for the talk, very much informative. And his question is, as a student at TUT doing nature conservation, how can one get involved? Also, are there opportunities that's only limited to the sea, like in the Western Cape, for example, or are there organizations in Gauteng or Pretoria?
Sure. So obviously, I'd like everybody to download the SASSI app, which is the easiest action you can do, and then make an informed choice when you're eating seafood. But also to question, to ask your retailers, to ask your suppliers, to ask your restaurateurs, your chefs, what is in my plate? Where was it farmed? How was it caught? And where is it from? So that's an easy way of getting involved. Another easy way is we run a SASSY training, and we train a lot of volunteers and keen people. There's different ways we do it. We can do it face-to-face, we can do it hybrid, we can do it online. We also have a digital platform that you just log on. It's free because the idea is to grow the awareness and get people to act. The idea is not to limit people because they have to pay for something. So that's an easy one. We do have a WWF office in Johannesburg. So he's more than welcome to pop in there. It's in Braamfontein, and to chat. We don't have a SASSY person there per se, but we do have other people. We have a volunteer program which you can sign up to. And when we have events or when we have projects that we work on, we call on our volunteers to come and pitch and join in. So there are quite a few options for him as well in Gauteng. Gauteng is the bane of my life because it, outside of the Western Cape, consumes more seafood than any other province.
Oh, sure.
And it
That's
gets a
interesting.
lot of its seafood from Mozambique. And I
Wow.
struggle because Mozambique, unfortunately, isn't in a situation to provide me with enough stock assessment data to be able to rate some of their species, because they just don't have the resources, the funding, or the expertise to do that work. So a lot of seafood coming in from Mozambique, we call unassessed. And we're working with WWF Mozambique to figure out how do we get a SASSY type project, even at its most preliminary, going into Mozambique, so that whatever the South Africans bring in, or whatever the Mozambicans bring into South Africa, we have some idea of what its sustainability status is.
Okay, that's something new. This is all available on the website, right?
Yes.
So I think if Mariette or I'll do it while we're on mute, I'm going to go to Sabile and then you, Marty. So I think while we're on mute, I'll just go to the website and share the links in the chat. Okay,
Thank
and
you,
then
yeah.
Sabile.
Yeah, do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Actually, Paul's mentioning Mozambique gives me a good entry point to what I wanted to say, because I mean, I'm living in a very different reality here in Tanzania for the last 40 years in an African village, where none of the choices you are mentioning for consumers exist at all. You know, people still buy from the fishers directly or from local fish dealers, and the food comes from local markets, farm to fork. So the choices are not industrially packed and processed food, but local food, which of course is much more healthy. If I had to decide now how to spend our money on campaigns, you know, I would actually prefer to target government policies to recognize the value of traditional ways of eating and providing food, producing food and getting it. And I mentioned in my comments the example of water, you know. What we see here, of course, like in the rest of Africa, is plastic pollution on the beaches, plastic bottles topping the pollution, which come from the urban areas, from urban centers. The villagers don't buy water in plastic. They have their shallow wells, and I'm using my tap water, yeah. So I would really target government policy and campaign for, with the money I have, like WWF or other donors, to maintain the drinking water supplies properly, which have been funded by donors for decades, which is tap water in rural, in urban areas and shallow wells in villages, and keep it drinkable, so people are not pushed into by, because that's happening at the moment, unfortunately. The plastic industry is pushing very hard into Tanzania. We have no local plastic production, it's imported, and bottlers are now considering buying plastic bottle making machines, so they can switch from glass bottles for soda drinks and even go into water plastic bottles as a new business idea. Government should stop that. That's the chance, you know, should stop and stem the tide of like Western, say in this case, South Africa, to be imported into our country. Yeah, so I would really spend the money on lobbying with government, and the consumers haven't even reached or known anything about the choices you have there, and which of course mostly unhealthy. Yeah, I think in Africa, in South Africa, it may be also very difficult for your budget to compete, you know, with the marketing campaigns of the corporate industry. You know, you promote SASI, while those chains promote a very different lifestyle and consumers' choices. And will you ever be able to compete with that kind of marketing? Yeah, which we don't see yet in our countries, and I don't want this to be imported. Yeah, I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, yeah, valuable points, and thank you for those comments. So, yes, accessibility to clean drinking water and enough water is a problem across Africa. It's not, you know, and it's becoming worse. The quality of water is scary. Easily, you can use a behavior model to influence policymakers and government. So you can develop a campaign that can work at the government level. Very often, it's the economics. So you have to also understand the political will and the economics as to why a government is allowing certain things to happen to our water systems. In South Africa, the kind of role WWF has taken is to look at strategic water source areas. So basically where your water comes from, and to work with as many of the water users, including government, at the strategic water source area, and to ensure that whatever happens downstream, the quality and accessibility is good enough to drink, it's potable, and it's trying. What we're trying to twin with that, very importantly, is not just plastics, but also the pollution and the dumping from communities along the river. And how do we deal with that? Because they have no waste removal. So it's a barrier, it's a physical barrier. They tell us, the ladies in the communities tell us, we will not throw our nappies into a river system if we had proper waste removal, but we don't. So we see that already. There's a behavior thing you can shift quite easily. In terms of the plastic bottles, that South Africa is trying to use I don't know if you know about the Ellen MacArthur Plastic Pact. So we've just developed the South African Plastic Pact. And one of that is, which WWF initiated and now is implemented through another party. One of the things there is looking at extended producer responsibility. We've now got a framework and a policy, and there's issues that they got to look after, they got to pay for it. So that's one way. In terms of SASI and the industry, what we're trying to do there is that kind of sister program I spoke to you about, where we're working with all the big retailers, and South Africa has 6. We're working with 5 of the 6 of them. We're working with one big supplier, and we're hoping to recruit more suppliers. And the understanding is to get them to start shifting how they deal in the market. And so far, I mean, places like Woolworths and Pick n Pay and Spar are sitting at about 80%, 70% of what they purchase is what we would rate as sustainable, or in a fisheries improvement project. So there are mechanisms, there are market mechanisms that you can use, and you can influence those market mechanisms by your behavior model. Yes, as I said to you, what happens in Tanzania is very different to what happens in South Africa, and you got to treat those two very differently. But that doesn't mean that you can't look at who that audience is. And you're absolutely right. If you don't think the consumers are the right audience in your context, absolutely, then you find that audience that you think you can have the biggest impact for with whatever resources you have at hand. And if it's looking at government and policymakers, then understand what are the mechanisms you need to put in place with government, with policymakers to kind of make those big shifts as well. And then kind of figure out yet, if it's activism and NGOism that's going to drive it in your country, then that's where you put your behavioral efforts into. If it's working with the middle part of the supply chain, the suppliers, or if it's working with the factory owners, etc., you got to figure out where your biggest impact will be, and then put your efforts in that.
Just quickly reply. Waste management is not the solution. No, it will never be with the amount of plastic, which will be increasing a bit 40% in the next few years. It will never catch up. It's impossible. So stop it from the source. Turn off the tap.
Absolutely.
And actually nappies, we don't have nappies here, except for a minute urban elite So forbid it, because nappies can never be recycled. It's a myth. Stop
Absolutely.
the nappies coming into the country. So
I fully
the
agree
myth
with
that
you.
this
Well,
is something which is not
necessarily-
alive and that you only need to manage it sustainably. There is no sustainable management of nappies.
I fully agree with you, Sybil. It is, but at the moment, when you get such an influx of nappies from China, which are cheap in South Africa, and everybody uses them,
And it's a myth. This is the narrations, and there you will find very soon it's not matter of behavior. I mean, as you mentioned, also there are other forces at play which are hugely powerful in terms of funding. Yeah, I mean, we know that. So let's look into that, you know, and find ways of influencing that level. That's what we're trying to do. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So, well, and like I say, make it relevant to your context. And that's how you work. And I agree, we got to close the tap, which is what we're trying to do, and working with retailers and recyclers, and also working with the plastic producers. But at the same time, we still have things like in South Africa, where we get thousands of hundreds of millions of nappies that are cheap, that are brought in from China and are made accessible to South Africans. And we still have to look at waste management as one of the interventions, as well as all the other ones that we put. As I spoke earlier, it's a multiple intervention process that you have to address when it comes to these problems.
Okay, thank you so much, Sybil, and thank you, Fabs. I see we're getting pressed for time, so I'm going to go to, okay, so first Marty, and then Holly, and then Tom. So Marty.
Well, thanks. Sybil's discussion about nappies sparked something that I wanted to ask as well. So that's not the main question because it hadn't come up yet, but just something about the other toweling nappies is they too actually are not great for sustainability from the amount of water that they use to wash them as well. So I think you know there's a lot of factors to all of these different things, and I don't know whether someone's actually done a proper study of the water, the detergent into the system, and all these other good things. I mean, my daughter's now 26 years old, and we had tried toweling nappies for a long time, and all the savings that we had from a cost point of view, I had a block drain from the nappy liners that my wife was putting down the toilet. So that was another bit of a nightmare. So, I mean, even toweling nappies have other things like the nappy liners and the other bits and pieces which are associated with them. So I'm not sure if an actual study's been done on the water use and all that. So that was the sort of first thing. Then the other comment you mentioned trout being better than the salmon, and for the reason of importing whatever. But I mean, as far as I'm aware, and I might be being revealing ignorance here, but trout isn't an indigenous fish in South Africa. So is it better to have now an introduced exotic species that we using to feed people, or should we actually be eating the indigenous fish, but that in the same breath also places the indigenous fish populations under pressure? So there's like this kind of
Absolutely, Marty. No, I agree with you. It's a win-lose-win situation. So the reason we promote trout, and you're absolutely right, it's an alien, is because it's farmed in cages. It's not farmed in river systems in South Africa. It's also farmed, and they have amazingly tight regulations in terms of invasives and how they can get into a natural system. So we're very fortunate that they don't farm in rivers. The other problem is obviously with eating aliens. South Africa's been eating aliens forever. 90% of our mussel industry is an alien mussel. It's an invasive. It runs that industry. If we didn't have that alien mussel, we probably wouldn't have mussel farms in Saldanha Bay, because our local mussels, they just don't grow fast enough. They don't proliferate as much. They're not as big spawners, and they're not as aggressive in terms of the size. The other thing which is interesting, and this is where the behavior part comes in, on the mussel side, we eat the alien mussel because the flesh is pink or the flesh is orange. The South African mussel, the flesh is brown. We don't find it palatable. So we there's demand for the alien ones. So, you know, it's such a difficult one. The other thing is, for the amount of sushi we are consuming, I don't see a local species fitting that bill. Honestly, most of our species are also whitefish, which is not ideal for sushi. So we'd have to rethink about what we would, and then to get South Africans to adopt. I know the ocean basket in South Africa tried for years and years to get South Africans to eat Nile perch. Nothing. However, all of the foreign nationals living in South Africa loved it because they're used to eating freshwater fish. But the local South Africans are so used to and only wanting to eat sea fish or marine fish that the ocean basket scrapped it off their menu. So, it's such a delicate dance that you have to do when you're trying to shift somebody's behavior to understand what is better for the environment and what is not. One of my biggest bugbears is why do we, for economical reasons, we export such good quality seafood? We should create that market locally. But we export 50% of all of the seafood we catch in this country. And we import really nonsense stuff. But because of the rand-dollar exchange, it's more profitable for a company to sell it overseas than it is for them to sell it on the local market. So how do we then build resilience in local markets? Because COVID taught us one thing: as soon as the ports closed, we were in trouble. We couldn't import good seafood, and we couldn't export. And because companies wanted the price point they get overseas, they couldn't sell it on local markets because the retailers saying it was just too expensive. So there's economics and a whole lot of things we're going to throw into the seafood mix in order to actually get where we are making sustainable choices all around.
I mean, just my last point is on the whole bottled water thing, whatever. I personally drink sparkling water, so it's actually quite a difficult choice to have. At home I have one of those soda stream systems and whatever, and I zhuzh the water that came out the tap from Rand Water, and I have a filter, so hopefully it's not going to kill me from that point of view, and whatever, and keep the bottles cold in the fridge and whatever. But if you're out and about, whatever the case is, there's no more sustainable way of getting sparkling water from anywhere. I mean, I don't know. So eventually you are buying the bottles if you're on holiday or wherever.
I think to your point,
is bottled water worse than, for example, drinking another drink like a Coke in an aluminium can or something else in a glass bottle?
Yeah. Aluminium is obviously we've got so there are two elements here. I fully understand. You're on holiday, you've taken up so much of your water from home, and then you need water, on holiday, and you go into a store and it's in a PET bottle. So there's two things. The first thing is we have to get infrastructure right around how we process PET. We have to make so at the moment in South Africa, and this is a South African context I'm talking about, virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled. That's a problem for me. When virgin plastic that Sasol and Caltex, all these places make, is cheaper than actually recycle it. So what has happened is a lot of our recyclers have gone out of business in South Africa because they can't compete. So the idea is to then develop that infrastructure around recycling PET bottles, but also develop systems, as Sybil rightfully says, where we close the tap on how many bottles we push out as well. And then work in a circularity system where we get those bottles back in the system. So a bottle to bottle. And we get back into as a proper circular plastics economy. So you're not having that constant input of virgin bottles. You actually just keep using the recyclate that you have. And that is the answer to our question. If you look at nature, nature is your perfect circular system. Everything, the air you breathe, the sand, the water, the wind, the waves, carbon dioxide, everything works in a circular system. Nothing is wasted. And we got to move away from this linear, make, break, and trash. We got to move away from that linear system. And that's how we're going to get past that. And then you can have your sparkling water because it's sitting in a circular system. And you do it with not thinking, oh gosh, where is this bottle going to? Is it going to end up in the ocean?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Marty. Thanks, Bev. I'm just going to take this chance to say the first part of your question, I think, is almost the literal and figurative definition of catch-22.
Yeah.
Because it has two parts to everything. So I'm going to go for our last question, and that is Tom. And I think then Johan is I'm going to ask Johan to close off the session for tonight and for the year. So Tom.
Thank you. Pav, you get 2 gold stars for this presentation. Outstanding. You hit a lot of my heartstrings. What I'm doing these days is trying to better understand the intersection between wildlife security and food security. And relative to consumer behavior, the question that I will ask may seem like a loaded question, but it truly is not. I love this SASSy sort of framework that you discussed. And I'm wondering, in the years that you've been collecting data, have you addressed, or do you have any data on, in terms of outcomes of consumer behavior change? Do you discuss at all the increase or decrease of the cost of living of some of these results, and the increase or decrease in consumer choice? Because I think those are 2 key elements that we have to consider that don't often get talked about, that will influence, along with the traditional how I was raised as a kid kind of thing, and the episodic memories that come to light in adulthood, and those kinds of academic issues. I think the practical sort of life issues, I think we tend to overlook in favor of the political low-hanging fruit.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank
Great
you.
questions. Absolutely. So the cost of living question is such an interesting one, because seafood spreads across those different sectors of it. So for example, sardine is a low-income household protein must. It's so important to our low economic groups that it is zero VAT, so it doesn't have a tax on it. South African government doesn't put a tax on sardine. And it is your cheapest form of protein that you can get from the sea in South Africa. Okay. The problem being is that if you even add, and I don't know if you know, but even if you add a 2 rand increase on that tin, you basically prevent families from buying this resource. Right. So the cost of living becomes, until 2018, sardines were very sustainably caught, and their populations were really doing well. Since then, we've seen this complete decline in sardine stocks on the west coast of South Africa. Where now, and for those of you who might be surprised, in a South African can of sardines, 80% is sardines from Morocco and 20% is South African sardines. Okay. So somebody like ShopRite Checkers can't expect that price point to go up, because they service a low-income group. Whereas if it's a Woolworths shopper who buys sardines now and again, you smack on a 1 rand or 2 rand, doesn't really affect. So we definitely look at the cost of living. Now in South Africa, unfortunately, post-COVID, we have seen the cost of living just going up and up and up and up. But we haven't seen a decrease in seafood consumption. We're still seeing people eating sushi, ordering in sushi in restaurants. I don't know where you're based on, but if you have to go into an Ocean Basket, which is a very popular seafood franchise in South Africa, on payday, you'd be lucky to find a seat. So, we're kind of thinking, but when we did a survey on what is the protein, which was our last survey, that you most consume, was eggs. The protein that South Africans mostly rely on is eggs, then chicken, and seafood comes kind of down because beef is too expensive, lamb is too expensive. So they're looking for alternatives all the time, and it's informing their decisions. So one of the discussions we're having with retailers like ShopRite Checkers is, we can't afford to push the price up on sardines because it's such an important protein for the low-income groups of South Africa. And at SASSy, we're saying to them, but we're going to list it as red. The South African sardine is completely decimated. And our biggest canary in the coal mine has been the decline in our penguin populations. Since 1970, we've seen a 90% decline in the African penguin. Okay. The stats that BirdLife and Sancorp are sharing with us now is terrifying in terms of what is happening to this bird. And it's because there's no food. There's no sardines available for them. So definitely the cost of living is something important. The consumer choice is interesting because it depends on who you're looking at. And who that consumer is. So your middle to higher income consumers still eating seafood, hey? Still wanting it in restaurants, still ordering it as sushi, still buying it uncooked, still wanting it fresh from the guys selling it on the bakkie. The seafood in South Africa is a pretty interesting commodity that they eat because they have access to other proteins. So we're not like some of your island states or your more coastal countries that are so reliant that if you took away the marine protein, they'd be stuck. We have chicken, we have fish, we have beef, we have, but yet South Africans still will choose seafood. We haven't seen a big shift away from seafood.
So, Pav, one last comment,
Sure.
reply. With respect to the sardine phenomenon you're talking about, doesn't this provide a corporate opportunity?
It does.
And
Absolutely.
so does SASE get involved with that? Because I saw one of the slides you talked about getting together the responsible fisheries, et cetera, in one of your diagrams.
Yeah. So what we're doing now, and this is something that we've been doing for the last, I think, 15 years, Tom, is we're getting very involved as WWF in fisheries improvement projects. And what that is, we're looking at the fishery and saying, what do they need to do to improve their practices? And if that means not fishing for sardine, then that's what we're going to push for. But we're using our retailers and our suppliers who are so vital to that supply chain, to that value chain, to help co-fund fisheries improvement projects, because a lot of the industry will say, oh, we don't have enough money, blah, 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 blah. So to actually co-fund. So Woolworths and Pick n Pay have been the first two big retailers to actually come to the table and says, we will give you money and we will jointly co-fund with the fishing industry on these species to improve the fishery. Okay, that's the one thing. And we then act as the implementer of those improvement projects as WWF South Africa, so that you can ensure that they're actually doing what they're saying they're doing. So we develop the work plan, etc. Are they putting observers on boats? We know that they do something called higher grading. So they catch, and then somebody radios them and says, oh, they're bigger sardines this side, and they dump the smaller ones and they steam off and catch the bigger ones. So those kind of illegal practices and unsustainable practices, an observer would be able to report on. Does it need a gear change? Does it need a TAC, a total allowable catch reduction? And where they've been extreme, and I'm not too sure how many people on the call know this, where things have been extreme, in 2019, we took government to court as an NGO around the West Coast rock lobster because they weren't dropping the total allowable catch. And industry was just happy to say, well, it's legal tender, we're not doing anything wrong, we'll catch. And WWF we weren't getting through to industry, we weren't getting the kind of help we needed. And we took it was then called the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries to court, and we won the case. And they had to lower the TAC. So I think there's several mechanisms you have to use, but more and more what we're seeing is that the corporate world, are realizing that they have to start looking at ways of enabling improvement project when it comes to the national environment. And the last way in which we're working with them is through our Sustainable Finance Coalition. And the Sustainable Finance Coalition is looking at sustainable. So most companies that are listed in South Africa now through the Johannesburg Stock Exchange have to answer to the ESG. Now, the E has always been so fluffy, and the S and the G, the social and the governance is easy, but the environment has been very murky and very nebulous. And more recently, a whole bunch of NGOs as well as WWF have been working with the JSE to help develop principles and indicators and guidelines around the E part of the ESG. Now companies are forced to report against ESG. And what we're saying is that if you want to really report transparently and honestly, you got to show how you've been working. And if I'm then go to the person that your company lends money from, and I say, hey, these guys are destroying the ocean. You know, you shouldn't be lending them money, or you shouldn't be telling your investors to invest money in them. You start creating the leverage around different ways of investing. And then you say, okay, but we've got these green instruments that we've developed that you can put your money into. And that's another way of kind of leaving. So we've just got a really nice, strong team around sustainable financing as well. And we've just started something called the Sustainable Finance Coalition as well. So we're trying everything. Everything
Very good. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Ayesha, go for it.
No, I just wanted to say thank you to Tom. We unfortunately out of time, because perhaps I have so many questions, not questions, discussions that I would like to have with you, but yeah, I will email you or call you or something. And then just before we go to Johan, and then on a lighter note, I asked you to come at the end of the year, but starting to wonder if you have a side hustle for New Year's resolutions so we can change, because you advertised the vegetables quite well earlier. But with that, thank you very much, Pavs. This is an amazing talk. And I'm going to open up to Johan now.
Pleasure, Aisha. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Pavs. We will definitely have to invite you back next year. That's the unfortunate part of you doing such a brilliant job. You simply have to come back. We will be running a workshop on penguin conservation next year. And definitely we would like to have your perspective on the matter as well. Then a very special thank you also to Marty. Marty is an honorary ranger with Sandbox, but he's also honorary ranger with Share Screen Africa and Unlocking Nature. Really doing duty for us when we have to be in other places. We can always call on Marty. So Marty, we really appreciate it. And we also appreciate the questions and the natural curiosity. Yeah. It's really fun to have you around. It's great to have been with you this evening and learn with the whole community. We look forward to seeing you again in 2024 and continue the learning journey. See you next year and have a beautiful Christmas.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you.